June 7th, 1944, Normandy, France. German soldiers stand in the wreckage of their own airfield. Burnt Messerschmitts smolder under the morning sun, their twisted frames still radiating heat from yesterday's inferno. The acrid smell of aviation fuel and scorched metal hangs in the air like a funeral shroud. In the distance, the rumble of American bombers returns the same squadrons they thought they destroyed just yesterday. One soldier mutters, half in awe, half in despair, "It's impossible. They were all shot down, every one of them." Yet here they were again, wave after wave, formation after formation, their silver wings catching the light like an unstoppable tide. How could an army lose so much and replace it overnight? This was the mystery of American war production. A system so vast, so relentless that the Germans couldn't comprehend it. This is the story of how industrial logic defeated military genius, and how numbers, not just courage, decided the skies. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. At the start of the war, Germany's air force was the pride of Europe, fast, lethal, disciplined. They had pioneered blitzkrieg, perfected coordination between ground and air, and dominated the skies of Poland, France, and the early battles of Britain. Their pilots were legends, their tactics revolutionary, their confidence absolute. But by mid-1944, something had changed. For every plane, Germany lost America seemed to replace 5. The mathematics of war were no longer about strategy or skill or even bravery. They were about capacity, raw, unending mechanical capacity. American soldiers joked that their factories fought alongside them, that for every man in uniform there were 10 workers back home, building the weapons he would carry into battle. To German officers, it was unthinkable. "They fight with machines, not men," said one Luftwaffe pilot, exhaustion heavy in his voice, as he watched endless squadrons of B-17 seconds filling the sky, like migrating birds that never landed, never rested, never stopped coming. The question remains, how did America build such power so quickly and so endlessly?
Machines, not men.
The answer lies in a silent revolution of production, one that transformed the very nature of war itself. It wasn't won in the trenches or the skies alone. It was won in factories thousands of miles from any battlefield in assembly lines that ran 24 hours a day in the hands of workers who would never see combat, but whose labor would decide its outcome. This was warfare reimagined not as a clash of armies, but as a contest of industrial will. Not as a test of individual heroism, but as a measurement of organizational genius. The Germans had built an air force of elite warriors. The Americans had built a system that made warriors obsolete, and in that difference lay the fate of nations. Early 1943, the Ruhr Valley burns. Luftwaffe radar picks up another massive formation, hundreds of American bombers escorted by swarms of fighters. The screens glow with countless dots, each one representing tons of steel and explosives hurtling toward German industry. The Germans scramble to intercept. Messerschmitt fighters claw their way into the sky, their engines screaming defiance. Flak batteries open up, filling the air with bursts of black smoke and shrapnel. The sky becomes a chaotic tapestry of tracer fire and burning fuel. Dozens of B-17 seconds fall their wings, shearing off their fuselages, tumbling end over end toward the earth below. Parachutes blossom like white flowers against the grey clouds. German pilots bank hard, counting their kills, certain they've delivered a devastating blow. But the next morning, the same number appears again, same formation, same precision, same relentless determination. And the morning after that, and the morning after that, the Germans begin to call them Der Endlos Strom, the endless stream. It becomes a phrase whispered in mess halls and briefing rooms, spoken with a mixture of disbelief and creeping dread. How could they keep coming? American crews joke that their planes are factory fresh, still smelling of paint and machine oil when they first climb aboard. In truth, they often were. Behind every bomber shot down over Germany, another rolled off an assembly line in Detroit or Los Angeles before the smoke even cleared over Europe. It was the first time in history that production lines became part of the battlefield itself, that the rhythm of factories began to dictate the tempo of war. German pilots were among the best in the world, skilled, experienced, fearless. They knew every tactic, every maneuver. They could read the sky like a language only they understood. But what good was skill against mathematics? What was bravery worth against logistics? The Luftwaffe's tactical brilliance was powerless against it. They could win every engagement, shoot down twice their number, and still wake the next day to find the sky filled again with American bombers. It was like fighting the ocean itself. You could drain a bucket, but the tide always returned. One German officer standing in the rubble of a bombed factory watched the contrails streak across the sky and understood with terrible clarity, this was not a war they could win through excellence. This was a war of attrition, and attrition favored the side that never ran out. America had turned warfare into production, and production into an unstoppable force of nature. In 1940, the United States had the 19th largest army in the world, smaller than Portugal's, barely larger than Belgium's. Its military was a peacetime force, equipped with outdated rifles and aging aircraft, unprepared for the scale of what was coming. 3 years later, it was building 96,000 aircraft per year. The transformation was unprecedented in human history. Factories, once making cars, typewriters and refrigerators, became centers of aviation production almost overnight. Assembly lines that had produced sedans and station wagons were retooled, redesigned, reimagined for a single purpose, building the machines of war. Ford built the Willow Run plant outside Detroit, a single mile-long factory designed to assemble a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The building itself was a marvel, stretching across the Michigan landscape like a steel cathedral dedicated to production. Inside, men and women worked in shifts around the clock, illuminated by endless rows of fluorescent lights that turned night into perpetual day. They moved with choreographed precision, each person a component in a vast human machine synchronized to steel and rivets and the ticking clock of war. Welders sent showers of sparks cascading across the factory floor. Riveters hammered aluminum sheets into place with rhythmic precision. Inspectors checked tolerances with calipers and micrometers, ensuring every part met exact specifications. It was organized chaos on an unimaginable scale. To the Germans, it was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Their own factories were smaller, more specialized, built for quality over quantity. German engineers crafted each aircraft with meticulous care, treating production as an art form. Their planes were masterpieces, beautifully designed, precisely engineered, superior in many ways to their American counterparts. But masterpieces take time, and time was something Germany no longer had. To historians, the American industrial mobilization remains the most ambitious conversion in human history. An entire economy pivoted from peace to war, from consumer goods to combat equipment, from individual prosperity to collective survival. This was the arsenal of democracy, and it ran on organization, mathematics, and relentless efficiency. It ran on the belief that freedom itself could be industrialized, that democracy didn't make a nation weak, but gave it access to reserves of strength that tyranny could never match. Every citizen became a soldier in this invisible army. Every factory became a fortress, every shift whistle became a battle cry. And somewhere across the Atlantic, German commanders began receiving reports that made no strategic sense, that violated every principle of warfare. They understood the Americans were not just replacing their losses, they were accelerating. Production wasn't slowing under the strain of war, it was increasing month after month, reaching levels that seemed physically impossible. The arsenal had awakened, and it would not sleep again until victory was absolute. Inside these factories, the war took a different shape. There was no smoke from gunfire, no thunder of artillery, only the pounding rhythm of machinery that never stopped, never faltered, never questioned its purpose. Riveters, welders, and assemblers worked side by side, men too old to fight women, too vital to lose teenagers, eager to prove themselves immigrants, desperate to defend their adopted home. They came from farms and cities, from classrooms and kitchen tables, unified by a single mission. Rosie the Riveter was not just propaganda painted on posters. She was arithmetic made flesh. She was the grandmother working the night shift because her grandson flew B-17 seconds over Berlin. She was the young mother whose husband trained pilots in Texas. She was the college girl who postponed her dreams because the world was burning and someone had to build the tools to put out the fire. Every hour meant another wing assembled, another fuselage, joined another bomber destined for the sky over Europe. The mathematics were simple and brutal. More planes meant more missions meant more pressure on Germany, more pressure meant the war would end sooner. Every rivet was a prayer, every weld was an act of defiance. The American home front became a second front unseen by the enemy. but utterly decisive. While soldiers fought in mud and blood, factory workers fought with precision and endurance, their battlefield lit by fluorescent tubes instead of muzzle flashes. They worked through holidays and birthdays, through heat waves and blizzards. They worked through the heartbreak of telegram notifications, through the joy of letters from overseas, through the endless uncertainty of whether their labor would bring their loved ones home or simply extend the agony. When German officers reported shooting down 60 bombers in a single day, a devastating tactical victory by any measure, they did not realize that in Detroit, Los Angeles, and Dallas, that number was already being replaced. The assembly lines had anticipated the loss before it even happened. The war had turned into a contest of momentum, and the United States never stopped moving. Night shift workers clocked in as day shift workers stumbled out, exhausted but proud. The factories hummed through darkness and dawn through winter, cold and summer heat, their output measured not in units but in overwhelming abundance. German spies reported the numbers back to Berlin, but their superiors dismissed the intelligence as impossible, as American exaggeration designed to spread defeatism. No nation could produce at such rates. No economy could sustain such output. But the Americans weren't trying to sustain it, they were trying to accelerate it. Production targets were met, then exceeded, then doubled. What seemed impossible in 1942 became routine by 1943. Efficiency experts roamed the factory floors, stopwatches in hand shaving, seconds off every process, eliminating wasted motion, perfecting the dance of industrial war. And in the skies over Europe, the results spoke louder than any propaganda. An endless procession of American aircraft, each one carrying the fingerprints of workers who would never be celebrated, never be remembered, never receive medals for their service. But they were winning the war just the same. Every American aircraft carried not just fuel and bombs, but numbers. Each one was a statistical guarantee, a data point in an equation that stretched from factory floors to European skies. Engineers calculated expected losses with cold precision. They knew that combat attrition rates hovered around certain percentages, that mechanical failures would claim a predictable number, that weather and human error would account for more. They built these calculations into production schedules the way architects build load-bearing walls into blueprints. If 1,000 bombers entered Europe, planners already knew how many would return, and how soon they'd be replaced. It was war by mathematics, warfare reduced to spreadsheets and supply curves, victory measured in production quotas rather than battlefield heroics. The Luftwaffe fought with instinct and bravery, with the kind of individual skill that made legends. Their aces were household names, their tactics studied in military academies. They flew with the pride of warriors who believed that excellence mattered, that quality could triumph over quantity. The Americans fought with algorithms and logistics, with organizational charts and replacement schedules. They built redundancy into every system, backup plans for the backup plans, supply chains so deep that disruption became nearly impossible. For the Germans, every plane lost was a tragedy. A skilled pilot gone, an irreplaceable aircraft destroyed, months of production erased in seconds. Each loss was mourned, each empty chair in the mess hall, a reminder of what could not be recovered. For the Americans, it was an equation, one that could be solved with production lines and steel. Losses were expected, losses were planned for, losses were already compensated for before they occurred. "They don't seem to run out," wrote a German commander in his diary, the words heavy with exhaustion and dawning understanding. "It is as if their machines are immortal." But it wasn't immortality. It was something more profound and more terrifying. It was the industrialization of replacement itself. American logistics officers tracked every aircraft like inventory in a vast warehouse. They knew which squadrons needed reinforcements, which bases required spare parts, which supply routes could handle additional throughput. Information flowed through channels as efficiently as the aluminum and steel that became bombers. Radio reports from Europe arrived in Washington within hours. Production adjustments were made within days. New aircraft rolled off assembly lines within weeks. The cycle was relentless, mechanical, unstoppable. German intelligence officers studied captured American documents and found maintenance schedules that planned aircraft rotation months in advance. Replacement timelines that assumed losses before they happened, supply chains that treated combat attrition as a solved problem rather than an uncertain variable. It was a different philosophy of war entirely. Where Germany trusted in the exceptional, the superior aircraft, the elite pilot, the brilliant tactical maneuver, America trusted in the systematic, the reliable aircraft, the adequate pilot, the overwhelming numerical advantage. And in the crucible of total war, the systematic was proving superior to the exceptional. You could not shoot down a system. You could not outmaneuver logistics. You could not intimidate an assembly line. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and absolute. America could afford to lose. Germany could not. And that difference, more than any battle or strategy or technological breakthrough, was deciding the war. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was dying faster than it could be reborn. German factories, once the pride of European industry, now operated under constant bombardment. Allied bombers struck by day and night, turning production centers into rubble, killing skilled workers who could not be replaced, destroying machine tools that had taken years to build. Aluminum supplies dwindled as mines fell to advancing armies, and supply routes were cut by partisan attacks. Fuel became scarce, rationed so strictly that training flights were cancelled, leaving inexperienced pilots to learn combat in combat itself, an education that usually ended in death. And the pilots, the irreplaceable pilots, the aces who had dominated the skies over France and Britain, were gone, now shot down or reassigned, or simply too exhausted to continue. In their place came boys barely old enough to shave, rushed through abbreviated training programs, sent into the air with a handful of flight hours and a prayer. They flew against American pilots who had trained for months in peaceful Texas skies, who had fuel to practice time, to learn instructors who could afford to be patient, because there was always another class waiting, another wave of recruits ready to fill the ranks. Hitler demanded miracle weapons, jets and rockets, and experimental aircraft that existed more in imagination than reality. Engineers gave him prototypes, beautiful and advanced, and utterly insufficient. America gave itself repetition, endless, reliable mechanical repetition. For every Me-262 jet fighter prototype that Germany painstakingly assembled, the United States produced 200 P-51 Mustangs. Not better aircraft perhaps, but 200 of them. 200 chances to win, 200 replacements waiting. German officers began to understand in those final desperate months that they were not fighting a nation. They were fighting an industrial organism, a vast machine that had no pride, no emotion, no capacity for exhaustion. It simply produced day after day with the inevitability of a natural force, and it did not tire. We fought an army that replaced itself faster than we could destroy it. One captured Luftwaffe pilot told his interrogators, his voice hollow with the weight of impossible odds. Every morning we would count our victories from the day before. Every afternoon we would watch the same number return. The mathematics had become unbearable. German mechanics worked miracles, keeping damaged aircraft flying, cannibalizing parts from wrecks, improvising repairs with whatever materials they could scavenge. Their American counterparts simply requisitioned new planes. German pilots flew missions until their aircraft literally fell apart in the air, nursing damaged engines through one more sortie, one more desperate attempt to stem the tide. American pilots rotated home after a set number of missions, replaced by fresh crews who had never seen combat. In the end, the Luftwaffe wasn't defeated in the sky. It was defeated on the factory floor, in the supply depot, in the training academy that couldn't produce pilots fast enough, in the aluminum mine that fell silent under Allied bombs. It was defeated by arithmetic. The Germans had built an air force of warriors. The Americans had built a system of warfare, and systems, once they reach critical momentum, are almost impossible to stop. Geography decided industry's fate. While Germany's cities burned under relentless bombardment, America's factories thrived beneath peaceful skies, untouched by the war they were feeding, with endless streams of steel and aluminum. Detroit, Chicago, Seattle, vast networks of production working in absolute safety. Their only enemy, the clock, their only danger, the possibility of falling behind schedule. Germany's factories were targets painted on maps in Allied briefing rooms, marked for destruction, prioritized by strategic importance. Every plant, every workshop, every assembly hall lived under the constant threat of annihilation from above. America's factories were sanctuaries protected by two oceans and the sacrifice of those fighting overseas. The only bombs falling on American soil were metaphorical production quotas that seemed impossibly high until they were exceeded, then raised again. When Allied bombers destroyed a German aircraft plant, the damage cascaded through the entire production system. Parts suppliers went offline, specialized tools were lost, skilled workers died or fled. Months of production capacity vanished in a single night of fire. When tornadoes hit American plants, when accidents shut down production lines, replacement shipments arrived within hours from neighboring facilities. The system absorbed disruption the way an ocean absorbs rain, momentary ripples on an infinite surface. Efficiency met security, and together they created something unstoppable. Germany produced brilliant jet fighters that flew faster than anything in the sky, rockets that touched the edge of space, precision engines that represented the pinnacle of engineering achievement. Their aircraft were works of art, each one a testament to human ingenuity and technical mastery. But America produced volume. Thousands upon thousands of adequate aircraft, reliable if not revolutionary, effective if not exceptional. Planes that mechanics could repair with common tools, that pilots could fly with standard training, that factories could build without exotic materials or specialized expertise. In peacetime, the German approach would have been admired, studied, celebrated. In total war, it was a death sentence, because quantity, when it reaches a certain threshold, develops a quality all its own. One German jet could outfly 10 American fighters, but there were always 20 American fighters. A Luftwaffe ace could shoot down a dozen bombers, but there were always 50 more behind them. The Luftwaffe's precision was a masterpiece hanging in a burning museum. America's redundancy was immortality stamped in steel. German engineers designed aircraft that pushed the boundaries of physics. American engineers designed production systems that pushed the boundaries of logistics. Both were genius, but only one could win a war of attrition. And this was fundamentally a war of attrition. The geographic blessing of the United States, isolated from enemies rich in resources, vast in industrial capacity, transformed every advantage into multiplication. Not just safe factories, but factories that could expand. Not just available workers, but workers who could focus entirely on production without fearing for their lives. German workers assembled bombers while listening for air raid sirens, knowing that the aircraft they built might be destroyed before it ever left the ground. American workers assembled bombers while listening to swing music on factory radios. Their greatest danger, a potential accident on the production line. The psychological difference was immeasurable. The practical difference decided the war. Detroit built what Dresden could never match, not better weapons, but an inexhaustible supply of adequate ones. And in the end, that was enough. They never saw the front lines, yet they fought every hour of every day. The invisible army of American industry engineers calculating stress loads and fuel capacities, machinists operating lathes with micrometer precision, welders joining aluminum sheets with perfect seams, mothers working double shifts while worrying about sons overseas. They filled hangars with wings and fuselages. They operated cranes that lifted engines into place. They packed supply trains with spare parts and ammunition. They painted serial numbers onto tail sections, each number representing not just an aircraft but a promise. A promise that America would not abandon its soldiers, would not run out, would not surrender to exhaustion. In their hands, raw aluminum transformed into armor. Loose rivets became wings capable of carrying men across oceans. Individual components became instruments of liberation. These workers rarely appeared in newsreels or received medals or had their names recorded in official histories. They clocked in, did their jobs, clocked out, and returned the next day to do it again. To them, a crashed bomber reported in the morning newspaper wasn't an abstract tragedy or a distant statistic. It was a ticket to another shift, another reason to work faster, another aircraft that needed building. They didn't just replace planes. They replaced despair with momentum, helplessness with purpose, uncertainty with the steady rhythm of production that never wavered. The Germans could not understand it because they had never fought a war that was both moral and mechanical, that combined ideological conviction with industrial organization that treated patriotism as something measured in output rather than speeches. Nazi Germany had tried to industrialize warfare through compulsion and terror through slave labor, and occupied factories through conquered resources and subjugated populations. But fear produces only what fear can extract, and extraction has limits. American production ran on something more powerful, voluntary commitment, collective purpose. The genuine belief that every rivet mattered, that every hour of overtime brought victory closer, that individual effort contributed to something that's larger than self. Factory workers bought war bonds with their paychecks, donated blood during their lunch breaks, planted victory gardens in their yards. They didn't just work for wages, they worked for brothers and sons and husbands fighting overseas for neighbors who had already made the ultimate sacrifice for a future they believed was worth building. This was the Invisible Army's secret weapon they cared. Not because they were forced to, not because propaganda convinced them, but because the war was real to them in ways it could never be to a German factory worker laboring under occupation or coercion. Every woman welding bomber fuselages remembered the last letter from her husband. Every grandfather operating a lathe thought about grandsons in uniform. Every teenager packing parachutes imagined the pilot whose life might depend on their attention to detail. The Americans had made production itself an act of war, had transformed manufacturing into a form of combat where the weapon was reliability and the victory was measured in uninterrupted supply. And that transformation from industrial capacity to industrial warfare, from making things to making victory possible, represented a revolution as significant as any tactical innovation or technological breakthrough. The Invisible Army never fired a shot, never flew a mission, never saw the enemy except in newsreels and propaganda posters. But they won the war just the same, one shift at a time, one aircraft at a time, one rivet at a time. Spring 1945. The war nears its end. Over Germany, the skies roar with a sound that has become constant, inescapable, apocalyptic. Thousands of bombers, stretching from horizon to horizon, their formations so vast that they blot out the sun. German civilians emerge from shelters and stare upward at what seems impossible, what defies comprehension. The sky itself appears made of metal, a ceiling of aluminum and steel, moving with terrible purpose across the heavens. Children who have known only war count the aircraft until they lose track, until the numbers become meaningless. Old men who remember the pride of German aviation shake their heads in silent disbelief. Women clutch photographs of sons who flew against this endless armada and never came home. For the Luftwaffe, it is over. The last pilots take off, knowing they will not return, knowing the mathematics have reached their inevitable conclusion. They climb into obsolete aircraft with nearly empty fuel tanks, rising to meet an enemy that outnumbers them 100 to 1. They fly into an endless wall of American planes, each one a reminder that defeat was not personal, but industrial. Not a failure of courage or skill, but a failure of capacity, of geography, of the fundamental resources that make modern warfare possible. Some pilots cry as they climb into their cockpits for the final time. Others laugh bitterly at the absurdity of fighting the inevitable. A few maintain the old pride, the warrior's conviction that honor matters even in hopeless causes. But all of them understand in these last desperate days what their commanders understood months ago. They are not losing to better pilots or superior tactics or more advanced technology. They are losing to arithmetic. The mathematics of war had reached their conclusion, had rendered their verdict with the cold precision of numbers that cannot lie, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be defeated through willpower alone. The American aircraft overhead represent more than firepower. They represent an entire philosophy of warfare proven correct. The belief that organization can defeat genius, that reliability can overcome excellence, that democratic mobilization possesses strengths that authoritarianism can never match. Every bomber in that endless sky carried the labor of workers in Detroit, the calculations of engineers in Seattle, the sacrifice of families across America who gave their time and energy and loved ones to a cause they believed was just. The sky, once a battlefield where individual pilots determined outcomes through skill and courage, had become an assembly line, a conveyor belt of American industrial might, moving inexorably toward victory. German anti-aircraft guns fire into the formations, their shells bursting uselessly against the sheer mass of aircraft. A few bombers fall trailing smoke and flame, their crews tumbling through empty air. But the formations close the gaps immediately, absorbing losses without breaking stride, continuing their missions with mechanical indifference. Because for every bomber that falls, 3 more wait in England. For every one in England, 10 more are being built in America. For every 10 being built, 100 more are planned. The pipeline never ends. The Germans had fought brilliantly, had adapted tactically, had shown remarkable resilience under impossible circumstances. But they had fought against an enemy that made resilience obsolete, that had industrialized warfare so thoroughly that individual battles no longer mattered. They had fought the sky itself, and the sky never emptied. When the war ended, America had built 300,000 aircraft, more than all Axis powers combined, more than seemed physically possible, more than could ever be used, even in a conflict that consumed the entire world. Entire fleets sat unused in storage facilities across the American Southwest, their purpose already outpaced by victory. Thousands of pristine bombers that never saw combat lined desert airfields, monuments to productive capacity so vast it exceeded even the demands of global war. To the Germans who survived, who returned to ruined cities and occupied zones, the memory was haunting in ways that battlefield defeat could never be. They had lost before. Armies had been beaten territory, surrendered, tactical retreats executed. But this was different. This was the realization that they had fought against something fundamentally unbeatable, not because it was invincible in battle, but because it could not be exhausted. One Luftwaffe officer years later, in a memoir written with trembling hands, tried to explain what it had felt like. "We fought an enemy who replaced every loss before it even happened. We shot down their bombers by the dozen, and they returned by the 100. We destroyed their fighters in the morning, and by afternoon the sky was full again." It was not war, as we understood it. It was industrial mathematics applied to human destruction, and we had no answer for it. Historians call it the logistics miracle, though miracle suggests divine intervention rather than human organization. But it wasn't just numbers on production charts or statistics in economic reports. It was a philosophy, a profound belief that war could be won not through improvisation or individual brilliance, but through process, through system, through the patient accumulation of overwhelming advantage. American democracy had industrialized itself without descending into tyranny, had coordinated millions without resorting to coercion, had mobilized an entire society while maintaining the freedoms that defined it. That was its true weapon, more powerful than any bomber or fighter. It proved that freedom could be efficient, and that human will, when organized voluntarily around shared purpose, could outproduce fear, could manufacture more than oppression, could sustain effort longer than authoritarianism. The totalitarian states had promised that only ruthless control could achieve total mobilization. America demonstrated the opposite, that democratic societies, when genuinely threatened, could mobilize more completely and more effectively than any dictatorship, precisely because their citizens chose to participate rather than be forced. The factories that built B-24 bombers would soon build Chevrolets and Fords, converting back to peacetime production with the same efficiency they had shown in war. The workers who welded aircraft fuselages would build houses in sprawling suburbs, construct highways that connected a continent, manufacture consumer goods that defined an era of prosperity. The war machine became the post-war world, the industrial capacity that won the conflict, transforming into the economic dominance that defined the second half of the 20th century. The same organizational genius that coordinated bomber production would coordinate corporate supply chains. The same quality control that ensured aircraft safety would ensure consumer product reliability. The same logistics networks that supplied armies overseas would distribute goods across global markets. The sky that once carried destruction would soon carry commerce passenger aircraft built by the same companies, using the same techniques, employing the same workers who had turned aluminum into instruments of war. And the mathematics that built bombers would build prosperity, translating industrial capacity into economic growth, production efficiency into rising living standards, organizational excellence into geopolitical power. The lesson was clear, though often forgotten in the decades that followed. Wars are not won primarily through tactical genius or technological superiority, or even the courage of individual soldiers, though all those things matter. Wars are won through the patient, unglamorous work of organization, through supply chains that function, production systems that scale, logistics networks that deliver, and most importantly, through societies that can mobilize their full capacity while maintaining their essential character. Germany had possessed brilliant generals, superior technology in many areas, soldiers as brave as any in history. But they had lacked the one thing that ultimately mattered, the capacity to sustain, to replace, to continue when continuation seemed impossible. America's victory was not inevitable when the war began. But it became inevitable once American industry reached full mobilization, once the factories achieved their rhythm, once the system demonstrated it could not be stopped. The German troops standing in that ruined French airfield in June 1944, watching American bombers return impossibly soon after being destroyed, had witnessed the future of warfare, industrial, systematic, overwhelming. They could not understand it because their entire military tradition was built on the opposite belief that excellence mattered more than quantity, that superior warriors could defeat superior numbers, that will could triumph over resources. History proved them wrong, not through any single battle, but through the accumulated weight of production that never stopped replacements, that never ended supply, that never ran dry. In the end, it wasn't the brilliance of strategy or the heroism of a few that turned the tide. It was the hum of machinery running through the night. It was the rhythm of factories that never slept. It was the silent endurance of those who never saw the front, but fought just as surely with wrenches and welding torches, and the stubborn refusal to let exhaustion win. The German troops could not understand how America replaced its losses so quickly, because they had never seen an enemy that fought with organization, as a weapon that turned logistics into a lethal force that made the factory floor as decisive as any battlefield. In war, courage wins battles, but production wins wars. And on that truth, simple, brutal, undeniable, the 20th century was built, shaped by the hands of an invisible army that proved democracy's greatest strength was not its ideals alone, but its capacity to transform those ideals into overwhelming, unstoppable reality.